6th of April, 1909. A desolate, ice-cold void. Here, there is no earthly definition of day or night. There is no east or west. There is only endless ice and a geographical point that has birthed the most daring dreams and terrifying nightmares of humans for centuries: the geographic North Pole. Through the steam of breath freezing in the bitter cold, a group of men moves forward. Their bodies are breaking down from fatigue. Their skin is riddled with frostbite wounds. Leading the team is the American explorer Robert Edwin Peary. With him are his most trusted companion, Matthew Henson, and 4 Inuit hunters, Uta, Egigingwa, Siglu, and Ukwea. For more than 40 days, they have traversed a terrifying path. Finally, Peary measured the sun's position with his sextant instrument and announced that they had reached that imaginary point of the Earth's axis where all longitude lines meet. Peary planted the American flag on the chest of the ice. It seemed as if centuries of an inhuman struggle had come to an end. But when Peary returns to the civilized world preparing to announce the news of his victory, news comes like an explosion. His own countryman, Dr. Fred Cook, has claimed that he reached the North Pole almost a year earlier, on April 21, 1908, beating Peary. Thus begins the 20th century's biggest geographical debate. Who was first? The determined, somewhat arrogant, but highly organized Robert Peary? Or the friendly, but somewhat messy and controversial Dr. Frederick Cook? Or were both victims of error? Or were both the century's greatest frauds? Why did man bet his life, wealth, and everything to conquer this ice-cold void? How did a polar expedition that was an attempt to find trade routes turn into a terrifying war of national glory and personal ambition? And who were those pioneers who fought against the ice long before Peary or Cook to advance human footprints little by little toward the top of the world? We will try to find the answers to all these questions. In today's episode, the race to conquer the North Pole, or polar fever, actually began hundreds of years ago. Since the time of the ancient Greeks, the concept of a mysterious icy region in the north of the earth was prevalent. The philosopher Pythias spoke of a land called Ultima Thule, which was the final boundary of the known world. But after the Middle Ages, this mythical curiosity was replaced by a practical and economic necessity. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European powers became desperate to establish direct trade routes with the vast markets of spices and silk in Asia. But the route going around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope was long and controlled by the Portuguese. Again, the route going west around America was occupied by the Spanish. So, British, Dutch, and French merchants began searching for an alternative route. Their idea was that there must be a short water route to reach Asia through the north of America or the north of Siberia, Russia. These two imaginary paths are known in history as the Northwest Passage and the Northeast Passage. This search for commercial routes brought humans face to face with the terrifying reality of the Arctic or North Pole region for the first time. Explorers like Henry Hudson, Martin Frobisher, and William Barents tried to cross the northern ice sea with their small wooden ships. Many of them never returned. Their ships were either crushed by the pressure of the ice and lost in the depths of the ocean, or the sailors died of starvation, or froze to death in the cold, or died of a terrible disease called scurvy. They could not reach the North Pole, but the maps and logbooks they left behind showed the way for future explorers. In the 19th century, the purpose of these expeditions began to change. After the invention of the steam engine and technologically advanced ships, geographical discovery and national glory became bigger than commercial routes. An intense competition began to fill in the last white part of the world map. At this time, a new concept was born: farthest north, or reaching the furthest point north. the North Pole was still an unimaginable distance away. So, the goal of every expedition became to break the record of the previous explorer and reach a few miles further north. British Navy officer Sir William Edward Parry set out on a daring expedition in 1827. Leaving his ship, he used two special boats like sledges and started a journey toward the pole over the ice. But what he did not imagine was that the ice sheet he was walking north on was itself drifting towards the south. Working backbreakingly hard every day to advance 15 to 20 kilometers, he would see that due to the ice current, they had actually advanced only 4 to 5 kilometers. After about a month, reaching 82 degrees 45 minutes north latitude, he was forced to give up. He could not reach the pole, but he held the record for farthest north for the next half-century. These expeditions proved that courage and willpower alone were not enough to conquer the North Pole. A new strategy and a deep ability to understand the character of nature were needed. In the second half of the 19th century, a new chapter of North Pole expeditions began. This time, the target was clearer: the geographic North Pole directly. Two expeditions of this time deeply influenced the history of polar exploration, although both ended in disaster. The first was the British Arctic expedition led by Captain George Nares between 1875 and 1876. The British Navy organized this huge expedition to restore their glory as the world's strongest naval power. Under the leadership of Captain George Nares, two powerful steamships, HMS Alert and HMS Discovery, started their journey along the northwest coast of Greenland towards the Kennedy Channel. Their strategy was to take the ships as far north as possible, and from there launch the final expedition toward the pole via man-hauling or sledges pulled by humans. Captain Nares managed to anchor the ship near 82 degrees north latitude, which was a new record. Then, under the leadership of Commander Albert Hastings Markham, a sledge party started the journey toward the pole. Their sledges were incredibly heavy. To pull each sledge, 7 or 8 sailors had to work literally like animals with ropes. The ice surface was uneven and filled with huge ice piles or pressure ridges. Advancing just 1 or 2 miles a day was difficult, but their biggest enemy became scurvy. Due to the lack of vitamin C from fresh fruit or meat, the sailors' bodies began to break down. Their gums were bleeding, old wounds were reopening, and due to extreme weakness, they could not walk. When Markham's team reached 83 degrees 20 minutes north latitude, more than half of their members were on their deathbeds. They managed to break Parry's record, but they had to pay a terrible price for it. In the end, after somehow returning to the ship, the entire expedition was declared a failure. This expedition proved that the British Navy's traditional man-hauling method was completely useless for conquering the Arctic. The second expedition was George de Long's Jeannette expedition from 1879 to 1881. American Navy Lieutenant Commander George Washington de Long believed in a different theory regarding North Pole expeditions. Like many geographers of the time, he also thought that Japan's warm Kuroshio Current enters the Arctic Ocean through the Bering Strait, and as a result, there is a warm, ice-free sea, or open polar sea, near the pole. His plan was to reach the pole directly by ship with the help of this current. Funded by James Gordon Bennett, owner of the New York Herald newspaper, de Long started his journey from San Francisco with his ship USS Jeannette. But shortly after crossing the Bering Strait, he realized the hard way how wrong his theory was. Not only was no warm sea found, but in September 1879, the Jeannette got stuck in a huge ice pack near the coast of Siberia. Then began a chapter of nightmares. For about 21 months, the ship kept drifting west along with the ice. Finally, in June 1881, under the immense pressure of the ice, the wooden structure of the Jeannette broke. and the ship sank into the depths of the ocean. De Long and his 33 sailors were then helpless in the middle of an endless ice field, hundreds of miles away from the Siberian coast. Using 3 small boats, pulling them over the ice and rowing in open water, they started an incredible journey toward the delta of the Lena River in Siberia. But in a terrifying storm, the 3 boats got separated from each other. One boat, with all its sailors, was lost forever. The second boat managed to reach the coast, and these sailors were rescued by local hunters. But De Long's boat reached a desolate, uninhabited coast. Due to lack of food, freezing in the cold, and extreme exhaustion, De Long and his companions died one by one. Their logbooks and diaries, which were recovered later, are among the most tragic and heart-touching documents in the history of Arctic exploration. The Jeannette expedition was a terrible failure, but it had an unexpected result. 3 years later, wreckage from the Jeannette ship washed up on the southwest coast of Greenland. This proved that the ice of the Arctic Ocean flows in a specific direction. This information inspired a Norwegian explorer who wanted to change the strategy of polar exploration forever. Fridtjof Nansen was a scientist, an athlete, and a dreamer. He was a national hero of Norway, who had earlier become the first person to cross ice-covered Greenland on skis. The discovery of Jeannette's wreckage gave birth to a groundbreaking idea in Nansen's head. He thought, if the ice flows from west to east, then why fight against the ice? Why not use the ice current itself as his vehicle? His plan was simple, but extremely daring. He would build a special ship that, instead of being crushed by the pressure of the ice, would rise on top of the ice. Then he would take the ship near the coast of Siberia, intentionally freeze it into the ice, and leave himself in the hands of nature. He hoped that within 3 to 4 years, the ice current would take the ship directly over the North Pole, or very close to it, towards Greenland. The ship Nansen built for this plan was named Fram, which means forward in Norwegian. Fram was a marvel of engineering. Its structure was round and smooth like an egg. When the ice applied pressure from both sides, instead of being crushed like ordinary ships, Fram would rise on top of the ice. Its walls were 3-layered and thick, which could protect the sailors from the intense cold. In 1893, Nansen and his 12 companions started the journey with Fram. Near the New Siberian Islands, they froze the ship into the ice. Then began a long, slow, and psychologically exhausting wait. Fram kept drifting slowly along with the ice, sometimes north, sometimes west. There was a windmill on the ship that generated electricity, and they had a huge library to pass the time. After a year passed, Nansen realized that the ice current would not take him exactly over the pole, but would go somewhat south of it. In March 1895, when they reached 84 degrees north latitude, Nansen made a daring decision. He decided to leave the ship and his comfortable life and start a final expedition toward the pole with just one companion, Hjalmar Johansen, using skis and kayaks along with dog-pulled sledges. Their goal was to reach the pole in 50 days and from there return toward the archipelago called Franz Josef Land. But the reality of the Arctic was harder than their imagination. The ice surface was uneven and full of pressure ridges. Their path was repeatedly obstructed by ice cracks or open water leads. 3 weeks later, reaching 86 degrees 13 minutes, 6 seconds north latitude, Nansen realized that it was impossible for them to reach the pole. Their food was running out, and ahead lay a long and uncertain return journey. They had set a new record for farthest north, but now they had to fight to survive. On the way back to Franz Josef Land, they had to eat almost all their dogs. In August 1895, they reached the coast of the archipelago and decided to build a shelter to spend the winter. They built a small hut with stones and rocks and used a walrus hide as its roof. For the next 9 months, Nansen and Johansen lived in this primitive state. Their only fuel was walrus blubber, and their food was polar bear and walrus meat. The following summer, they started journeying south again, and it was here that an incredible event occurred. One day, Nansen heard a sound like a dog barking. At first, he thought it was a delusion of his mind, but after hearing the sound again, he went in that direction and saw a human being. It was the British explorer Frederick Jackson, who was conducting an expedition in Franz Josef Land. After about 3 years of being isolated from the civilized world, Nansen and Johansen were unexpectedly rescued. Shortly after this, the ship Fram also broke free from the ice and returned to Norway. Nansen's expedition was an epic success. He could not reach the pole, but he proved that with the right technology and the mindset to adapt to nature, it is possible to conquer the Arctic. His ship Fram and his strategies opened a new horizon for the next generation of polar explorers. After Nansen's record, Italy entered this international competition to conquer the North Pole. A member of the Italian royal family, Prince Luigi Amadeo, Duke of the Abruzzi, was an experienced mountaineer and explorer. He planned to take Nansen's strategy one step further. In 1899, he reached Franz Josef Land with a ship named Stella Polare, or Pole Star. His plan was to establish a base camp there to spend the winter and send dog-pulled sledges toward the pole the following spring. His team included Italian Navy officer Umberto Cagni and several experienced alpine guides. But during the winter, a disaster occurred. During a training trip, the Duke suffered severe frostbite on his hand, and 2 of his fingers had to be amputated. As a result, he lost the ability to lead the polar journey himself. But instead of canceling the expedition, he gave this responsibility to his trusted companion, Captain Umberto Cagni. In March 1900, a team led by Cagni started the journey toward the pole. They were better prepared than Nansen, and their strategy was more aggressive. About a month later, they surpassed Nansen's farthest north record. Finally, reaching 86 degrees 34 minutes north latitude, they planted the Italian flag. They managed to reach about 20 nautical miles, or 37 kilometers further north than Nansen. However, their return journey was terrifying. Their food had run out, and 3 members of the team were lost forever. But Cagni and his companions somehow managed to return to base camp. The Duke of the Abruzzi's expedition proved that by basing on Nansen's strategy, through proper planning and firm determination, humans were slowly advancing toward the pole. The competition then became even more intense. This time, the person who had made the expedition the sole goal of his life entered the stage. Robert Peary. Robert Edwin Peary was a civil engineer in the American Navy, but his true passion was Arctic discovery. He was fiercely ambitious, stubborn, and a man skilled in the power of publicity. To him, conquering the North Pole was a dream that had occupied more than 2 decades of his life. Peary's early expeditions were in Greenland. It was there that he realized 2 important things. First, European strategies were useless for surviving in the Arctic environment. The only key to survival was the knowledge and techniques of those who lived there successfully, the Inuit or Eskimos. Peary learned from the Inuit how to make clothes from animal skins, build igloos, and drive dog-pulled sledges. Second, he found an invaluable companion like Matthew Henson. Henson was an African-American explorer who had been with Peary since his first expedition. He mastered the Inuit language and their culture wonderfully and had no equal in sledge construction and repair. Peary himself admitted that it would not have been possible for him to conquer the pole without Henson. Based on these experiences, Peary developed a special method for conquering the pole known as the Peary system. One part of this was taking Inuit assistance. Peary did not just take male explorers on his expeditions, but took Inuit hunters and their entire families with him. The women would sew special clothes from animal skins, which were much more effective than any European clothing. Instead of man-hauling, he relied entirely on dog-pulled sledges. Additionally, along the route of the expedition, he would build stores of food and equipment, or caches, at various places beforehand. However, his most significant innovation was the support party system. His main expedition was divided into several small teams. Each team was led by an experienced explorer. They would all start the journey together. The first team would clear the path up to a certain distance, establish a cache, and then hand over their best dogs and extra supplies to the main team and return to base camp. Then the second team would clear the path a bit further and return. By having support parties return one after another, like this, the team that remained for the final polar journey would be the freshest, and their sledges would be the lightest, because they only had to carry supplies to reach the pole and return to the last cache. Using this system, in 1906, Peary broke the Duke of the Abruzzes record and reached 87 degrees 6 minutes north latitude. But due to a huge open water lead, he could not advance further and somehow returned almost starving. This failure made him even more determined. He began preparing for the last and final expedition of his life. While Peary was busy collecting funds and creating plans for his final expedition, his old rival appeared on the Arctic stage, Dr. Frederick Albert Cook. Cook was a physician who had worked as a doctor on one of Peary's Greenland expeditions. He had also participated in a Belgian expedition to Antarctica earlier, where his companion was the young Roald Amundsen. Cook's personality was the exact opposite of Peary's. Where Peary was authoritarian and unpopular with many, Cook was friendly and sympathetic. But some controversy was attached to his reputation. A few years prior, he had claimed that he conquered North America's highest peak, Mount McKinley, currently known as Denali. But later, this claim was proven false. In 1907, Cook started a journey to the north of Greenland speaking of a hunting expedition, but his real intention was the North Pole. In contrast to Peary's huge arrangement, Cook's plan was extremely simple. He started his journey toward the pole in February 1908 with just 2 Inuit companions, Awela and Itukashuk, on a light sledge. His strategy was living off the land, or surviving by collecting food from nature. He planned to arrange food for himself and the dogs by hunting polar bears or seals. This was an incredibly risky plan. A year later, in April 1909, Cook returned to an isolated settlement in Greenland and claimed that he and his 2 companions had reached the North Pole a year earlier, on April 21, 1908. His story was of an epic expedition. After reaching the pole, on the way back, he got caught in terrifying ice currents and was forced to spend the winter in an ice cave on an island in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. But there was a big problem with his claim. He had no undeniable proof. He had left his sextant and other instruments, along with his detailed diaries and navigational records, with an American hunter named Harry Whitney for safekeeping, which were later claimed to be lost or thrown away. His only witnesses were his 2 Inuit companions, whose statements were vague and contradictory. When Cook announced his claim, it created a stir worldwide. But the lack of evidence and the controversial past regarding Mount McKinley made his claim questionable from the start. In August 1908, when it was thought that Cook was lost somewhere in the Arctic, Robert Peary started his journey with his huge expedition. His ship, the Roosevelt, reached Cape Sheridan on Canada's Ellesmere Island. There, he and his team established a winter base camp. His team included experienced explorers like Matthew Henson, Captain Bartlett, Ross Marvin, and several dozen Inuit men, women, and children. On March 1, 1909, Peary's planned Arctic assault began. The advance team led by Captain Bartlett went ahead to clear the path and build the trail. Then, one after another, support parties followed them. The Peary system was working like a precise clockwork. Every few days, a support party would finish their work and return. And the main team was becoming smaller, lighter, and faster. About a month later, they reached 87 degrees 47 minutes north latitude. This was the designated point for Captain Bartlett to return. Bartlett was an extremely skilled navigator, and he wanted to be Peary's companion on the final journey. But Peary ordered him to return. Peary later wrote that he wanted the final glory of victory to be achieved only by himself as an American. For the final polar team, Peary chose Matthew Henson and 4 Inuit, Uta, Egegingwa, Siglu, and Ukwea. This decision was highly controversial because neither Henson nor the Inuit could independently navigate or verify Peary's calculations. Peary claimed that in the last 5 days of the journey, Peary's team advanced at an incredible speed. Finally, on April 6, 1909, Peary announced that they had reached their goal. He planted the American flag at Camp Jessup and spent the next 30 hours taking navigation readings at various places and taking pictures. On the way back, when Peary established first contact with the civilized world, he immediately learned of Dr. Cook's claim. Peary became furious. He called Cook a fraud and started a huge publicity campaign to establish his own claim. The conflict between these two explorers then became a sensational front-page story in New York newspapers. The Peary versus Cook debate was a battle of personality and politics more than science. On Peary's side were powerful institutions like the National Geographic Society and the New York Times. On the other hand, Cook had the sympathy of the common people and the New York Herald newspaper. But Cook's biggest weakness was the lack of proof. He had no navigational records that could be independently verified. The descriptions by his Inuit companions were also vague. They said they had made a long journey and saw no land, but they were not sure if they had reached the Big Nail or the Pole. Cook's history of lies regarding Mount McKinley also severely questioned his credibility. However, the picture of the Arctic presented in his description was realistic. Some experts believed that his strategy of a small and light expedition had enough potential to succeed. On the other hand, Peary had a detailed diary and navigational records. He had explorers as witnesses, although they were not with him in the final phase. His Peary system was a logical and well-planned strategy that increased his chances of success. Besides, the support of powerful institutions helped him get institutional recognition. However, there are serious doubts about Peary's claim as well. Several inconsistencies are found in his logbook. Especially after Captain Bartlett returned, the speed of his team suddenly almost doubled, which many experts consider impossible. In his diary, on the page for April 6th, there is no sign of victory or excitement. Rather, written there is, "The pole at last, the prize of 3 centuries. My dream and goal for 20 years. Mine at last. I cannot bring myself to realize it. It seems all so simple and commonplace." Many believe this line was added later in the empty space of that page. Besides, since there was no second navigator in his final team, there was no way to verify his calculations. For the past century, historians and experts have analyzed the claims of both explorers meticulously. British explorer and writer Wally Herbert, who himself in 1969 became the first person to cross the North Pole on dog-pulled sledges, examined Peary as diary and records and reached the conclusion that Peary was likely 30 to 60 miles away from the pole and had misrepresented his position either due to navigational errors or intentionally. Today, according to most historians, Cook likely did not even reach close to the pole. On the other hand, Peary reached very close, but he probably could not step on the exact point of the geographic pole. So, who reached the North Pole first? If we talk about surface travel, the undisputed first person is the British explorer Wally Herbert. If we talk about reaching by any means, the first person was the American aviator Richard Byrd, who claimed to have flown over the pole in a Fokker trimotor plane in 1926, although there is controversy regarding his claim too. The first verifiable victory came just 3 days later, when Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who had earlier conquered the South Pole, his American sponsor Lincoln Ellsworth, and Italian aviator Umberto Nobile flew over the pole from Svalbard to Alaska in an airship named Norge. And the first humans to land on the ice were a Soviet scientific team who landed there in an aircraft in 1937. The story of conquering the North Pole is not a story of a single individual's victory. It is an epic of the collective effort, sacrifice, and almost tragic deaths of many generations of explorers. It is a chapter where human insatiable curiosity and desire for fame faced the ruthless reality of nature. Starting from William Peary to George DeLong, Fridtjof Nansen to Umberto Cagni, everyone pushed the boundaries of human knowledge a little further north. The controversial story of Robert Peary and Frederick Cook is the final and most dramatic expression of that era. From their story, it may seem that victory in history is often vague, and truth can sometimes be as slippery as ice. Whatever their personal ambitions and flaws, these hunters of the pole were the daring children of their age. They faced an unknown, terrifying, and hostile world and paved the way for future generations with their infinite courage.